Sechas Nazir Daf Tes begins the second parak of the Masechta with a Mishnah discussing what happens when a person makes a neder nazirus, but he describes it in a way which is wrong. You can't have a nazirus like that. So how do we explain what he meant? So let's begin the Mishnah. We'll have a machlokas in the Mishnah. Machlokas is what the machlokas is, and then the Gemara will try to figure out what the explanations of all these machlokas are. So the Mishnah discusses a case where someone says, I am a nazir from figs, from either groigers, which are dried figs, or devela, which are pressed figs. Now, a nazir is not usher in figs, a nazir is usher in grapes. So he described it wrong. So the question is, what do we do with this? So we have machlokas Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, but there's two versions of what Beis Shammai holds. So the Tanakama's version of Beis Shammai is that he's a nazir. It's a regular nazirus, it works. We ignore what he said, that he said it's on figs. Beis Hillel says he's not a nazir. There's no nazirus here. Now, Rabbi Huda explains Beis Shammai that it's not a nazir, but it is a neder against figs. So we have therefore three opinions: nazir, not nazir, or neder. According to Rabbi Huda, we have to go after the guy, and he has to explain that he meant it as a neder. He can't just say stam that it's a neder. Now, Beis Hillel, in any circumstance, it says it's not a nazir and it's not a neder either. There's no neder here, and it doesn't matter what he says afterwards. Okay, so now the Gemara begins. The Gemara wants to know what's pshat. What's pshat on this machlokes as to whether it's a nazirus or not. So the Gemara first wants to say it's a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yosi. What happens when somebody says a statement that has two parts? How do you consider the two parts? Rabbi Meir says you look at the first thing he says and you ignore anything else. First thing he says is chal and everything else is meaningless. So therefore, that's what Beis Shammai holds. Beis Shammai says when he says Harini nazir, he made a nazirus. Afterwards, he says from figs. Okay, you ignore that. That's meaningless. Now, Rabbi Yosi says you have to take it all together, and therefore Rabbi Yosi would say here also you have to take it all together, and there's an automatic cancellation of this nazirus here because he put in there that he's a nazir from figs, and there's no such thing as a nazirus from figs. Because that's Beis Hillel's opinion that this nazirus is worthless. So the Gemara says right away that this Beis Shammai's opinion can't make any sense, and it's different than the standard Rabbi Yosi's opinion. The Mefarshim explain the reason that it's different is because in the case of Rabbi Yosi, you could at least explain. In the case of Rabbi Meir, that is, you could at least explain somehow how it all fits in to one thing. Over here, there's no way that you could explain what he meant by adding figs that means anything. So there's no way that Beis Shammai could possibly say, well, just ignore what he said afterwards. There is no explanation to it. You have to take it into account, and it doesn't fit. So we need another explanation of what this machlokes is. So says the Gemara, it's dependent on machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon. In case where somebody makes is mechayev himself a carbon, and he says he wants to make a carbon mincha from sa'irim, from the barley. There is no carbon mincha from the barley, at least not a voluntary one. So therefore, what do you do with this? It's a wrong neder. It's a wrong hischayvus. So Rabbi Meir says you have to explain it somehow, and he said it. So you have to explain what he's trying to do is to take his neder off. He said he's mechayev himself a neder of a carbon mincha. Then he wants to cancel it by saying, from the barley. And Beis Shammai say you can't cancel a nazirus. They hold, it says kadosh yiyeh, there is no shoel on nazirus, and therefore they say, since he can't cancel it, the fact that he tried to cancel it doesn't make a difference. Beis Hillel hold like Rabbi Shimon, who say that the person wasn't trying to cancel it, he said something wrong, and therefore his entire statement is meaningless. He didn't say it properly. It's meaningless. It has no validity. And therefore here in our Gemara, we would say that there's no validity to this, and therefore there is no nazirus created by this. The Gemara now quotes another brisa, which has different versions of the machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And there's two versions of this brisa. So we have two more versions of what this machlokes is. The brisa quotes Rabbi Nassan. So the first version of the brisa has it as follows. Beis Shammai says you have to check what the person means. Did he mean to make a neder or did he mean to make a nazirus? And whichever one he meant, that's what it is. It could be a neder, it could be a nazirus. Beis Hillel says you could check what he means, and if he meant it to be a neder, then it could be a neder, but it can't be any nazirus. According to this, what is the machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai? It's again the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi, except you have to also add Rabbi Huda's opinion. So Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Meir, and therefore we try to figure out what the person means. And he holds like Rabbi Yehuda that it could be a neder, that he's asering figs from himself, and therefore if he says that's what he meant, so then that's what he meant. If not, we'll say that he meant to just make a regular nazirus. According to Beis Hillel, we hold like Rabbi Yossi, you have to fit in everything, and it doesn't make sense, and therefore the whole thing is cancelled and it's meaningless. Now the second version of the Brisa has pretty much Rabbi Yehuda's opinion in our Mishnah, that according to Beis Shammai, you check him out. If he meant to say that it's a neder, then he makes a neder, but nazirus it can't be. And Beis Hillel says it's not neder and it's not nazirus. According to this, it's again the machokes, but it's the Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Huda, that he meant to say neder, if that's what you could say that he means. According to, and Beis Hillel holds like Rabbi Shimon that it's an improper expression, and therefore there's no validity to it at all. The Gemara now quotes at length the Mishnah in Menachos, which we referred to before, which has a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, and the Gemara wants to try to say, how does this line up with our Mishnah here? We'll have a machlokes about that as well. So the Mishnah there says, if somebody makes a neder to bring a carbon mincha, but he says it wrong, what's the halacha? So the cases are as follows. He says, I want to bring a mincha from the barley, or he says, I want to bring a mincha of non-sifted flour, or he says, I want to bring a mincha without oil and lavona, or he wants to bring a mincha of half an isaron or an isaron and a half. All these cases are wrong. You cannot bring any mincha like this. So the Tanakama holds we correct him and he brings the right one. He brings one from wheat and not from barley. He brings one from sifted flour and not from unsifted flour. He brings one with oil and lavona, and he brings either an isaron or two isaronim, which are valid karbanos. Now, Rabbi Shimon disagrees and says he didn't make a proper nedava, and therefore he doesn't bring anything. So, who does this fit with? So the Gemara has a machlokas. So Chizkiya says the Tanakama here has to be Beis Shammai in our Gemara. Beis Shammai in our Gemara said even if you do something wrong, we still fix it up. We don't mean you meant nothing. We don't understand as you made an error. We fit it in, and therefore if you said you want to be a Nazir from figs, we assume you meant regular Nazirus, and therefore we just give you regular Nazirus. That's obviously the opinion of the Tanakama here. And Rabbi Shimon would fit with Beis Hillel. Let's say we throw it out because it's meaningless. Now Rabbi Yochanan disagrees, and Rabbi Yochanan says no. Beis Hillel in our Mishnah would agree here that he brings a correct carbon like the Tanakama. Even though Beis Hillel in our Mishnah say that a Nazirus from figs is meaningless, here they would agree that this works. What's the reason? Because there's no contradiction between the first half of what he said and the second half of what he said. The first thing he said was he wants to bring a carbon mincha. Then he said from the barley. Now, mincha and barley are not a contradiction. There are menachos from barley. You just can't make an adava to them. So that's not contradictory terms necessarily, and therefore we could fit them in. In our Mishnah, where he said he wants to bring nazirus from figs, those are contradictions, and therefore it's meaningless. You can't do anything with that, and that's why Beis Hillel there says it's meaningless. But here they could agree that we do try to fit it together, and we accept what he said and correct him. Gemara now brings another machlokes between Chizkiya and Rabbi Yochanan, explaining that brisa over there. And this machlokes is, what if the person, instead of saying wants to bring a carbon mincha from barley, he says he wants to bring a carbon mincha from lentils? And here we're actually going to have, Chizkiya is going to change his opinion in the previous discussion. So the way we have it is as follows. If he says he wants to bring a carbon from the barley, we saw that there's a machlokes between Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon whether we can make that work and make him bring from wheat. Now, if he says from adashim, so Chizkiya says that's meaningless, and you cannot make him bring a carbon from wheat. You throw that out. And over there is no machlokes. As we'll see soon, Rabbi Yochanan will argue. But the Gemara is going to have a problem on each of them. So the Gemara says, why does Chizkiya say that you don't have the same machlokes in the case of barley? What's the difference between barley, that you don't have the same machlokes in the case of lentils? What's the difference between barley and lentils? You can't bring either of them as karbanos. The only difference is that there is such a thing as a korban mincha of barley. There's no such thing as a korban mincha of lentils. But according to Chizkiah, Beis Shammai are holding that you don't need to have that this makes sense somehow and it's not a contradiction. Beis Shammai said we assume he didn't mean to say nothing and we somehow explain what he means. And we don't have a problem with what he says afterwards. So therefore Beis Shammai should be able to say the same halacha even if he says lentils. What's the difference? You think about Beis Shammai's case, the guy says he wants to make nazirus from figs. That's meaningless. And yet still Beis Shammai accepts it. So mincha from lentils is just as meaningless. You should still be able to do something with that. So Gemara says Chizkiah actually changes. And Chizkiah says that this Mishnah, this Tanakama, is not really Beis Shammai's opinion. And the reason that he says this is because he's medayik in the Mishnah that it said a case of barley dafka and it didn't say lentils. If it would be Beis Shammai, then it should have said the same halacha is true if he says he wants to bring a korban mincha of lentils. But it didn't say that. Obviously, it's not true. Why would it not be true? Obviously, this Tanakama is not Beis Shammai. So whose opinion is it then? Gemara says this is Rabbi Huda's opinion. Rabbi Huda said if you ask him and he says he meant it as a neder, then you make it fit as a neder. If he meant to say it as nazirus, then you fit it in to be nazirus. Therefore, you ask him, and if he tries to fit it in, it fits. But that could only be if it's something that's fittable. However, in the case of lentils, you can't do anything with that, and that's where lentils is left out. The Gemara now quotes Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, and Rabbi Yochanan says, no, even in the case of Adoshim, the Tanakam would still say that it works. You could still bring a korban of chitim. Even if he says, I want to bring a korban mincha from lentils, the Tanakam would still say you could bring a korban mincha of chitim. So Gemara asks right away, this doesn't fit. Rabbi Yochanan said that this is the opinion of Beis Hill. This fits in with Beis Hill because there's no contradiction between the first part of the Mishnah and the latter part of the Mishnah. There's no contradiction between saying a mincha and saying sa'irim. Between mincha and adashim is definitely a contradiction. There is no type of mincha which you bring from lentils. So Gemara says, yeah, you're right. And Rabbi Yochanan would not say that this could be the same halacha would apply by lentils. Rabbi Yochanan is just talking to Chizkiah. Chizkiah gave up on his pshat because he was bothered by why can't you say the same thing because of lentils? Why can't you say the same machlokas apply? Why can't the Tanakama say in the case of lentils also? Why did the Tanakama leave lentils out? So Rabbi Yochanan is explaining to him, I'll tell you why he left lentils out. Because it's actually, barley is a bigger chiddush. Because if he says lentils, so then he's clearly trying to be chayzer. He's trying to contradict what he said before. And he's trying to take it down. So that's not such a chiddush to say you're trying to take it down. You can't take it down, we just go with your first thing. However, if he said barley, we may say, hey, he's not trying to cancel it. He really meant to say barley all along, and he meant a barley carbon. He meant a carbon saita, or a carbon omer, which is a mincha made from barley. But he can't be manad of that. So if he meant that, then his whole nedava is in the garbage. Because it can't mean anything. He meant to bring a carbon mincha of saita or of a carbon omer. That's not a carbon that can be menadev. Therefore, we should say that he did make a nedava. We don't have to throw out his latter part. We could accept it and understand that his whole thing was wrong because he tried to make a carbon that he can't make, and therefore we should say that he doesn't bring anything. Kamash Malon, the Mishnah. This is extra chiddush.